Buying your first home is a massive deal. Most people dream about owning their home one day, and it's a really cool dream to have. But in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the biggest mistakes first-time home buyers make and why they actually regret buying their property in the first place. I'm going to focus on your primary residence for today. There's a big discussion where some people call your primary residence a liability, and it really depends on how you see things and your end goals that you have in mind. I look at a primary residence as a non-cash producing asset, and at the end of the day, if you think of it, it can be a liability because you're the one that needs to live in it, so you're the one that needs to pay the bond. Of course, there's different scenarios where you buy it cash or where you focus to pay it off quickly. There's many advantages to owning your own home. But the purpose of today's video is to show you why majority of first-time home buyers regret their purchase because they make the following mistakes. The last point is something that majority of South Africans are not aware of. And it's shocking to see the massive amount of interest we pay to our bank. So make sure you stay until the end of the video to see what I'm talking about. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is that most South Africans start over-eager and buy a property without being informed. And there's something cool that I wanted to show you guys. Some people call it the transition curve, but this is something that's applicable to many things in life actually. So like we can see here, it's a chart that shows us our positives and our negatives, as well as time that it takes to complete. And what happens with first time buyers, they start here. So they start with uninformed optimism. It's what people call the honeymoon phase. And they're so excited to buy their first property because they think it's a good asset. It's something that will make them a lot of money over time. And overall, our parents always told us that your house is your best investment. And this is where most people start off. They travel from here and they get to a point where they start getting the information of, okay, it's more expensive than I thought. There's so many hidden costs involved. It's going to take a very long time for me to actually pay off my property. And they quickly realized that the transfer cost was very expensive. The maintenance adds up. You have to account for things that you really didn't actually budget for. And this is what happens at the end of the day. You get to the point where it's called informed pessimism, because now you have all the information that you previously actually didn't have, stuff that you really didn't bargain for. And most of the time what then actually happens is majority of people quit over here, and this part over here is what they call the value of despair. And this is actually so cool because it's applicable to business, it's applicable to personal goals, stuff like working out and whatever it might be. This curve is applicable to basically everything that we do in life. And the whole idea of this chart is to get to a point where we can get informed optimism, where we now realize, okay, maybe my house isn't necessarily my best investment. It's going to take a long time, but I just need to make sure I cover all my payments and never default on my debt. And eventually over time, this property will create a lot of wealth for me. This is kind of the idea behind this curve. And if we can get to a point where we pass this is where we can get to our completion phase. And this brings me to the next mistake so many people make, and it's buying properties in the wrong entities. I've heard professionals say, buy your first primary residence in your personal name, and from there you can start buying investment properties in different entities. And in my opinion, this is still very bad advice, because what ends up happening is these people probably never buy a second property, and now they own their primary residence in their own names, and this can create quite a lot of complications. And some of the biggest ones that I can think of is estate planning. Eventually you will pass away, or eventually you want to transfer your property to your kids or to other family members, and this whole process is not a very pleasant process. So owning your property in the right entity can, make this process so much more simpler, cheaper, and easier. And I'm a big believer of using a trust for your property that you actually live in. If this is a property that you want to live in and pay it off, and this is like your dream home, you're not planning to sell this property, a trust structure might be a good idea. There's obviously many different ways to structure a portfolio, from PTYs to a combination of trust with holding trusts. As your portfolio grows, your entities will evolve as well. That's a video for a different day. At the end of the day, you need to think of your longer term goal. Is it a property that you want to sell eventually? Because a lot of people talk about the capital gains tax exemption that you have with your primary residence of 2 million rand. But again, this is only for your first property and it's only up until 2 million rand. And my thought behind this is, why would you buy a property and then later sell it? That's not why we buy property. We want to buy it, hold it over a very long time so that it can compound in growth and eventually you can benefit from this investment. So with that said, people also underestimate the work and the cost involved with owning their primary residence. People think you buy a property and that's it. Realistically, there's a lot of maintenance involved with a property. And even if it's a small property, even if it's a sectional title property, there's things that a lot of people don't budget for. Simple things like transfer and registration costs that needs to be paid from your own pocket. Things like transfer duty in some cases. And some expenses that so many people do not really budget for is things like building insurance, if it's a freehold property, or a general maintenance, or basically upkeep. If you have a big garden, paying a gardener it's quite expensive if you add up the costs over a longer period of time. And what happens is people do not budget for these costs, and then eventually people kind of stop doing the maintenance. And what happens at the end of the day, your property can depreciate if you don't keep up with your maintenance. I've seen this so many times, people that live in a massive house and they don't necessarily have the funds or even the time to do upkeep, and the property deteriorates, from things like painting to plumbing work to gutters. There's so many different things, but this is actually reality, and this ends up affecting the value of your property. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is people don't really have a healthy reserve fund when they buy properties. I like to work on a minimum of 10% of the value of the property in reserves, and that can be in a savings account or within an access bond, which is ideal. But you need to have some form of additional funds available for emergencies and for upkeep and repairs and so on. Generally, properties might have no issues for 6 months, and then month 7 comes, your geyser bursts, you have plumbing issues, there might be electrical issues, and then you need to start paying a large amount of money towards your property to fix things because maintenance wasn't actually done. So what happens in this case is people would either literally just leave it, not repair it, or they might have to make additional debt, like using a credit card to pay for things that they didn't really budget for. So having a healthy reserve fund is a no-brainer. And again, this forms part of the next point. And it's, people overstretch themselves to buy properties that they can't really afford because they actually just want to impress other people. And I see this so often. If you look at social media today, it's all over social media. People flashing their fancy cars and their fancy clothes and phones and houses to impress people. Obviously they have a bit of a hidden agenda behind that, but people overall, friends and family, do exactly the same, and they overstretch themselves to buy properties that's more expensive than they can actually afford, especially if you don't budget for all the additional costs, and it ends up costing them a lot of money. A rule of thumb that I like to show to people is, if you go onto Property 24, for example, and you scroll down and you can see the amount that you qualify for. So let's say, for example, you have a salary of 80,000 Rand, a gross salary of 80,000 Rand per month. You can qualify for a property worth 2.7 million Rand. What I would do is cut that amount in half. And let's say we work on 50% of your salary, which is 41,000 Rand. That means you can qualify for a house of 1.35 million Rand. And this is kind of the area that I would search for property, especially if you don't own any other real estate. Because what ends up happening is people actually buy these expensive properties and later realize they need to account for things like insurance and rates and taxes as well. And that can cause quite a lot of issues, especially in the longer term, because we never know what can happen. We've seen this happen quite often, because stuff like your medical aid goes up, your insurance goes up, your security cost goes up, and at the end of the day, all these costs add up, And let's say, for example, we have high inflation. This will increase interest rates, shooting up your monthly payments, and a lot of people really don't account for that. And like in COVID, people had to sell their houses for next to nothing because they didn't have a healthy reserve fund and they overstretched themselves financially. And that brings me to the last point, the one that I wanted to talk about from the beginning. It's called amortization. People don't understand amortization. And I wanted to show you this example on Uber. And let's say we use a house of 1.35 million Rand, a term of 30 years, prime rate. And this is scary to see how much money you pay towards the bank as a property owner. So our monthly payment will be around 12,000 Rand. And we have a portion that is called interest payments and capital reduction payments. And this basically means that 11,813 Rand from your 12,349 Rand goes directly to interest towards the bank. You are actually only paying 536 Rand from your bond, meaning your capital amount that you're borrowing is only being reduced by 536 Rand. And just have a look at how scary this seems. If we scroll down, let's see after 2 years, now you're only paying 656 Rand. So in 2 years, your principal debt is down from 1350 to 1335. So that's around 15,000 Rand in 2 years that you paid off from your bond because of high interest. And this is something that people often overlook, because what happens is they make all the above mistakes that I mentioned and they get to year 4, for example, or year 5. And they decide that they want to sell their property. But if we have a look at the amount that they paid off, it might be something like 40,000 Rand. If we had to account for your transfer and registration cost, your selling cost, if they had to sell their property because of the stress, they lose quite a lot of money. And this is what happens so many times. People overlook these things, and the main driver behind buying a property is simply this thing that we were taught from a very young age, that your house is your best investment. And personally, I feel that it can be in many cases your worst investment because of the mistakes that so many people make. I'm not saying that it's a bad investment overall. I just feel that so many people, especially beginner property buyers, make these mistakes.